We're going to begin with a brief Standards 101 review. A lot of you are probably old hands, but there may be some newer companies listening in, so bear with us. General information sections, those are 1 through 4. The rest of the sections are dedicated, each dedicated to a different category of millwork. And at the beginning of all of those sections, you're going to see the statement that appears in red in this slide here, and that is, the following rules shall govern unless a project's contract documents require otherwise. In other words, when you have a specification from the architect for some particular detail, which is also covered by the standards, then in effect the standard really no longer applies to that detail. And it might be that the specification is in perfect harmony with the standard or the rule in the standard. But even if that specification is a 180-degree violation of the standards, the specification always prevails. So very often then, for any particular millwork item in your project scope, you're going to wind up with a product which is kind of a composite of details which have been specified and other details that have not been specified, so that detail would default to the AWS rules. And as an AWI member or a QCP licensee, your company is, of course, obligated to ensure that all of the AWS line items which do apply to that particular millwork product have been accounted for. The title of today's webinar may be slightly misleading in that we're not going to consider absolutely all of the parameters involved in producing compliant, transparent finished wall paneling, but we're going to specifically focus on what comprises a comprehensive specification checklist, you might say, for the veneer matching aspect of flush wall paneling. And we will have time at the end of the presentation for questions and comments, but we have no problem if something occurs to you that you want to share with us. You are very welcome to chime in at any time with a question or a comment. As we are all pretty aware of all of the various categories of millwork in the AWS, transparent finished wall paneling is often responsible to a great extent for whatever wow factor a project may have to offer. And evidence of that would be if you look at any issue of Design Solutions, which is the AWI quarterly review of outstanding woodworking projects by its members, you're typically going to see a whole lot of paneling featured in that publication, and with good reason. So there is a lot of reputation at stake for the designer and for the owner whose constituency is going to function in that space or visit that space, and certainly there's a lot at stake for those of you who are involved in the layup, fabrication, finishing, and installation of the wall panel features, and the detailers of that paneling also. But despite the fact that wall paneling is so out front and it's very important to get it right, this is an item for which we regularly see some contradictory specifications from the design community, and for those projects which QCP inspects, the end product does not always conform to the specifications and standards. Many of you, most of you probably, are aware that where QCP inspects a project, part of that inspection is the QCP representative reviewing shop drawings. It is basically a courtesy for the woodworker in an effort to find details that may not conform with the specifications or standards. And this is an attempt to help head off any of those issues before the project actually hits the floor and production begins, at which point obviously it's going to be a lot more difficult and a lot more expensive to correct a detail that is not conforming. And again, transparent finished wood paneling is one of those items that our representatives report is frequently lacking in the details that AWS Section 1 requires for wood wall paneling. And that, of course, where you have a lack of detail for anything you're building, that could be creating an opportunity for something to go south, and that's certainly true with wall paneling, given how complex that can be at times. This list you're seeing is from AWS Section 8. Section 8 deals with wall surfacing, and in Section 8, line item 1.2.10.1 states that for wood veneer wall surfacing, the design professional, in other words, the architect, is required to specify all of the items you see in this list. And what we're going to do is take these individually and break them down and review what the AWS minimum requirements are where any of these items have not been specified. And for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to assume a quality grade of premium, since that is what the overwhelming majority of specifications designate for anything that's got a transparent finish on it, but particularly wall paneling. And we're going to illustrate some of these requirements with photos from a project that QCP has previously inspected. So, point one on our list. It's pretty safe to say that the chances are just about zip that any of us will see a project for which no species is specified for transparent finish paneling. It's true that there are some other millwork categories where the AWS gives the woodworkers some authority and latitude in selecting materials if none are specified, but this ain't one of them. So once a species has been established, AWS Section 8 steers you to Sections 3 and 4, which are basic or are general information sections. And what you're going to find there are the basic aesthetic requirements for premium and custom grade lumber and veneer components for wall paneling. And this, you'll see this in other AWS sections too, being referred to 3 and 4 to see what the aesthetic requirements are. So, for example, 3 and 4 contains information regarding limits to the number of natural characteristics such as knots and so on. And these are listed by species and quality grade. And it's important to note that the aesthetic rules in Sections 3 and 4 apply only to visible faces of fully fabricated or installed millwork. This is not, we're not looking at a 4x8 sheet of plywood here. We're looking at the finished product. The rules in Section 3 and 4 apply only to a limited number of the more commonly used species, and the AWS lists what those species are. And if you compare the lists between lumber in 3 and sheet goods in Section 4, you'll see that there are different species on those lists. But in either case, if the species specified for your project's paneling is not included in that list, then as you can see at the bottom of the slide there, what the AWS says is that species not specifically covered by these standards shall be as agreed to between the owner, designer, professional, and the manufacturer/installer as to length requirements and size, exposed area of permitted natural characteristics. So if you've got some kind of exotic species, that is liable to apply. So now we've got the species. So we're moving on to points 2 and 3 of the list. In the absence of a veneer slicing specification from the architect, the AWS minimum requirement for both custom and premium grade is plain slicing. And just to mention, you can see the dots in the columns there. The column on the left is economy grade, the column in the middle is custom grade, the column on the right is premium grade. AWS in its section 4, which is covers sheet goods, has diagrams and descriptions which show exactly how the various methods of veneer slicing are accomplished, whether that's rotary, plain slice, quarter, rift, or what have you. But again, the default for premium and custom grade for wall paneling is plain slicing. And any other method of cutting has got to be specified or approved by the architect. In the absence of a specification for matching of adjacent veneer leaves, the adjacent leaves will be book matched. That's the default requirement, as you can see. If you look at page 73 in the AWS section 4, you'll find a detailed little summary and definition of what book matching is exactly. What you're seeing now is the first photo of our example project. I hope that is large enough for you to make out the grain in the panels there. It's a pretty good photograph. But this project is a small juvenile and domestic courthouse, and the specification called for numbered sets of book-matched material. The leaves you see in this elevation are plain sliced, and the adjacent leaves in the panel face to the right of the door are book matched. But to the left of the door, if you look closely, the adjacent leaves are slip matched. And incidentally, Section 4 also has a definition of slip matching as it does for book matching. So this elevation, despite the fact that it's pretty small and one would think pretty easy to control, does not conform with either the project specifications or the AWS.
Wayne, is that some sapwood in the casing and the door?
That is sapwood in the casing, Randy. Very alert when you can spot that. I did notice that. I wasn't going to bring it up, but since you have, that is undoubtedly in Section 3, you will find that that is an unacceptable natural characteristic for, I believe this is cherry.
Yeah, looks like it.
Yeah, premium grade. So we've got the species cut matching between adjacent veneer leaves. Now we're on to point 4 and 5 of our checklist, which concerns matching of veneer within each panel face and matching at the transition between adjacent panels. If there are no specifications regarding matching within the panel face, then the premium grade default in the AWS is for balance matched veneer, as you can see by the dot in the right-hand column there. The panels shall be sequenced, a sequenced and numbered set, and the panels will be custom manufactured for premium grade as opposed to off-the-shelf pre-manufactured sequenced and numbered sets, which, as you can see, is the minimum requirement for custom grade only. And we'll have a little more on that later. And again, this is the minimum requirement, and for any premium grade paneling, any variance from balance matching and custom fabricated sequence panels must be specified or approved by the architect. This is on page 74 in section 4 of the AWS. This is a description of balance matching and a couple of little illustrations there to further convey that idea. This is, of course, a little bit different than center matching, which is also defined on page 74.
So a balance match could actually be a bunch of an even number of leaves or an odd number of leaves, couldn't it?
It could be. Yep. Here is a second elevation from our Courthouse project example. And the veneer leaves, this is 4 panels comprising this elevation here. And the leaves within the 4 panel faces appear to be symmetrical and probably balance matched. But each panel's veneer is obviously from a different flitch, which means that the panels are not obviously custom manufactured. Neither are they sequenced, and so this elevation does not conform with the matching from panel to panel that the AWS requires. Again, it's a small elevation, only 4 panels involved, but care must be taken at all times. On to points 6 and 7 of our checklist, and this has to do with the requirement to specify end matching between panels adjacent to each other vertically, and the default for general grain direction of the veneer in a panel elevation. The AWS states that any vertical end matching must be specified by the design professional. And in the absence of that specification, there is no AWS requirement for wall panel end matching that we are aware of. The default direction for transparent finish wood grain is vertical. And again, anything other than that must be specified or approved by the architect. Something other than vertical direction grain we rarely see, but we have from time to time. There's one fairly large courthouse project in particular where all of the paneling was horizontal grain that comes to mind.
So now we're back to our picture, which our previous question about the end matching.
Exactly. And that's why we're looking at this picture a second time. Same elevation we saw before, and the shorter panels below the little horizontal trim there are not real easy to see, admittedly. By specification, those panels are required to be end matched. The lower panels to the right of the door, you can possibly make out that they do appear to be from the same flitch as the larger panels to the right of the door, the larger upper panels, but the grain is not aligned, and the lower panels on the left are from a completely different flitch than the upper panels on the left. So there is not a prayer that they are going to be end matched vertically. So with respect to vertical end matching and what the specifications required for this project, this elevation does not conform.
So end matching was specified by the architect.
Yep. Mm-hmm. In this case it was.
Wayne, it seems we have a question.
Certainly.
Tom would like to ask, is there a case in which the hardwood trim would have to match the panel sequence?
Good question.
Well, by matching, are we talking about grain, color, and so on? Or because if it's grain and color we're talking about, the standards generally for premium grade transparent finish stained millwork require that the components be well matched for grain and color.
And that's veneer to hardwood. But I don't know if the question was more specifically asking if that casing should be veneered. I've seen that happen where they actually took, a lesser grade, maybe poplar or something, and then veneered it with material from that same flitch. So it's possible to do that, but probably pretty unusual.
And there's nothing in the standard, certainly, that would require that. That sounds sort of like a blueprint match idea where in an elevation you might have this door that you're seeing as part of the veneer sequencing across that entire elevation. So if an architect thought that it would be a good idea to include that trim in the sequence, there's probably no reason that couldn't be specified. And I should just mention, as I'm sure most of you know, when a project is certified, that certification covers both specifications and the standards. So if that was specified in this project, that would have to be executed in order for this project to be certified if that was required by the specifications.
All right, great, thank you.
We're nearing the end of this particular list. On the list, it says that fire rating, if any, must be specified. That's not directly bearing on veneer matching, so we'll refer you to Section 8, where you can see the paneling, fire rating requirements, and information, and so forth. Flitch identification requirement is for the architect to provide the following information in contract documents regarding any specific flitches which he or she may have selected for the project. And that is AWS Section 8, 1.2.10.1.9. For selected flitches, the sources, gross footage of the flitches, and cost per square foot is what is required to be specified.
That's an important point. A lot of design professionals, when they specify a certain type of veneer, and even if they specify a flitch, I'm sure we've all seen that in different project specifications, they need to be aware that they need to first check if there's enough material in that flitch to complete the project. I was involved in a recent project where it became apparent that the specification, which was quartered walnut, American black walnut, and slip matched initially. I think they changed that to a random match, but it turned out that they needed to source, they needed actually to provide about 300 to 400 square feet of that, 300 to 400,000 square feet, of that black walnut quartered veneer. So they have to find enough material, and obviously you're not going to find it all in one tree. So you have to start a search for trees that are going to be very similar in grain and color, which is a huge task for American black walnut. If anybody's worked with it, you realize that it can vary quite a bit in color.
And there's one last point on this list, which is that any special figure, such as a bird's eye and maple, needs to be specified. So that covers this particular checklist as it appears under 1.2.10. However, there is one item in the rules in Section 8 for which a default exists, but there is no requirement to specify listed in the AWS, and that is where the veneer sequencing starts and stops within a project area. So that appeared to be kind of a loose end. And deciphering what is meant by matching within a project area presented one of those tricky little exercises that the standard sometimes asks of its user. The term project area is not defined in the AWS glossary. Can't find a definition specifically for project area in Section 8. If there is, there's no need listed for the architect to spell out exactly where a sequence starts or stops. Is it by room? Is it the entire project? Is it a portion of the building where maybe you can see several elevations simultaneously? As with anything in your project scope, the manufacturer and designer can come up with any kind of agreement they want to, which spells out where that might happen, but in the absence of a specification of this particular item, it happens to be the case that simply by specifying either custom or premium grade, the architect has indirectly set the requirements for matching within a project area. And here's how that works. In the general information section at the beginning of Section 8, there are illustrations of various kinds of matching and transitions of panel faces, quote unquote, within a room. And these illustrations discuss the expectations of the extent of sequencing for off-the-shelf, pre-manufactured, sequenced and numbered sets, also the made-to-order panels sized to the net dimensions required for a room, which, as we said, was the premium grade default. It also discusses made-to-order blueprint match panel. And the quote-unquote room discussed in these illustrations is the project area that the rules are talking about. In the interest of contrasting here, we'll talk about custom grade for a moment. We've seen that pre-manufactured sequence and numbered sets is the default for the minimum requirement for custom grade, and that's what you see in the illustration in the slide here. And the text that goes with the illustration states that a different sequenced and numbered paneling set may be used for each project area. Consequently, quote, paneling used from room to room may vary in color and grain characteristics, and that, quote, if more than one set is required within a room or project area, matching between sets cannot be expected. So that basically gives you the standard for custom grade matching within a quote-unquote project area. This is a good place to mention that there is one other thing that comes into play if, for example, you found yourself in a situation, a custom grade situation, where you're going to have a single room with more than one sequenced set of paneling in there. And that is in Section 8 on page 185. There is a rule that adjacent components, whether veneer or lumber, be at least compatible for grain and color in custom grade. So if you have a custom grade area where it's necessary to use more than one pre-manufactured set, where you have panels from the two different sets coming together and adjacent at the transition from one set to another, the appearance of their color and grain must at least be compatible. And since we're dealing with sequence sets, then by inference, hopefully all of the panels in the room will tend to be compatible for grain and color. So there is some, additional selection responsibility on the part of the manufacturer when it comes to a transition between two different panel sets. The illustration you see here is discussing or showing the made-to-order sequence match panel sets, which is the default for premium grade. The panels are manufactured to exact sizes based on the entire project's net footage and height needs. And the really major difference then as compared with custom grade is that, quote, the flitch shall be large enough to do the job, unquote. This is the type of thing Randy was just talking about. Since all the veneers from the same flitch, the expectation would be that you would have a very narrow range of color and grain characteristics throughout the entire project. And that can, of course, as Randy was saying, be a very theoretical statement to make in the real world, where a really large project might make it impossible or very difficult to obtain all of the square footage you need. And in that case, again, as he said, there's going to be some back and forth with the manufacturer and designer about the flitches they're going to wind up with.
Yeah, I had another project I was involved with recently that the specification was for American quarter-cut sycamore. American sycamore. I've never done a project in American sycamore. I've done it in European, but American sycamore has a very unique flake pattern, similar to a lacewood flake, if you're familiar with that. The difference being is that the flake varies in size throughout the log. It becomes very large in the center of the log and tapers out in the front and the back. The designer on this project, and I need to say that typically the waste factor on most projects is going to be 3 or 4 to 1. So for every 3 or 4 leads, you'll actually use 1 in the panel layout, and that's for a number of reasons, for size, defects, etc. In this particular project, the designer was so focused on the size of this flake that the waste factor went up to about 9 or 10 to 1. Obviously, that caused a cost impact. But that project is actually going to be featured in the next Design Solutions Magazine edition. Anyway, interesting.
That brings us to the end of this checklist. So we've got some time left here. The floor is open for questions. However you care to, questions and comments, however you care to transmit those to us.
I have a question I'd like to ask. Actually, I always have a couple of questions. Earlier we talked about shop drawing review, and I wanted to know, get a show of hands, how many folks listening have actually had their shop drawings reviewed by QCP? Okay, it looks like a number of people have. My follow-up question would be, did you find that helpful? I guess that's a yes or no call. Cameron, I don't know how you do that.
So far we have 1 yes.
Okay. Okay, Gary, it helped to point out some possible issues. Very good. That's good feedback. Thank you. One more question, my last question. How many folks listening have actually helped architects write specifications for projects?
All right, it looks like we have 2 that said yes.
Okay, very good.
I have one question, and that is, how many of the companies represented here regularly provide wood wall paneling as part of their product line?
Wow. It's like a majority, I guess. Very good.
Looks like anywhere between 100% and 25% of projects for any given company. There's a comment from Lynn Leach who says, occasionally, but we do a lot of conference tables which are similar, just horizontal.
Yeah. I have another question. How many people have seen a specification for birch or maple that said natural? Anybody seen that? Yeah. Okay.
A couple, yes.
Yeah. That can be a very dangerous specification. It's always good to provide some type samples or a mock-up or something that the design professional can take a look at and sign off on. It can be a big issue because a natural spec can allow a lot of color variation and more contrast, and it may not be at all what they're looking for. Most design professionals, when they say maple, they're thinking of this creamy, light-colored wood, not something that looks tan and gray.
One other question. I think this is backwards. I think we're supposed to be answering the questions, but anyway, if you had to put a percentage on the number of projects where the specifications have a contradiction in the wood wall paneling portion of that, what percentage would that be? a contradiction or some kind of error or ambiguity that would require follow-up to clarify what they were talking about. Tony says 50 to 75. Steve says 75 to 90%. 90% from Roger. It's actually higher than I thought it might be. Steve says, you mean there are actually jobs with clear specs?
I've heard that rumor, although it's probably not prevalent.
Well, if there are no further questions, Cameron, I think you have a couple of other things to cover.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Wayne and Randy, for your time and contributions in delivering today's webinar. I'd like to say thank you again to the QCP staff for hosting today's webinar. I'd also like to thank our participant members as well for joining us. I hope everyone found today's program to be informative and beneficial, and I hope to see you all back online soon. Have a fantastic day, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.